Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very much pleased to just to preside the third session. The third session just mentioned that the future of regional economic order in Northeast Asia, especially internationalization of RMB and trade issues, TPP and FTAs. Let me very briefly introduce the presenters and the discussant today. The first presenter is the David Dollar from Brookings Institution, and second, YUAN Peng from China Institute of Contemporary International Relations. The third presenter is Choi Byung-il from Ewha Women's University. And three discussants will follow the presentation. Thomas Wright from Brookings Institution, and WANG Zhengyi from Peking University, and Chang Yong-ro from Seoul National University. Actually, if you just recognize from the names, it is not a fake drama. It is real, but very coincidentally, the American presenter, his name is Dollar, and Chinese presenter, his name is Yuan. But it is real. It is real. So actually, but yeah, it will be more lively and vivid discussions and some kind of very good things we can just expect. Let me give them around 8 to 10 minutes for the presentation and the 6 or 8 minutes for the discussion. And then we will have the second round. And also, in the floor, if you have any questions, please just write down the note, and then I will just collect them and then just give it to the presenters and discussant. Okay, let's start from the American side, Dollar, from Brookings Institution.
Thank you very much, Jay-ho. Really a great pleasure to be here. I'd like to thank President Park and the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies for inviting me to this really fascinating trilateral conference. The topic of this panel is economic integration, or the regional economic order, and I'd just like to introduce 5 brief points to start off the discussion. First point is very obvious. There's been tremendous growth, economic growth, and growth of trade in this region, so there's really extraordinary progress with economic integration in Northeast Asia. I think a lot of this started with China joining the WTO in 2001. And that really set off a tremendous 10 to 15 years of economic growth, trade growth, and integration. Now, while there's been more and more trade, since China joined the WTO, there has not been much progress with trade agreements. One important exception is the US-Korea Free Trade Agreement, which is quite significant. But leaving that aside, I feel that there hasn't been much progress with further trade agreements. Second point I want to make concerns US-China bilateral economic relations. A number of people have referred to the unprecedented economic integration between the US and China, but I want to offer a slightly different and frankly more pessimistic view. Viewed from the United States, there's really not that much economic integration with China. From the United States point of view, our exports to China are less than 1% of GDP. United States is by far the largest provider of foreign direct investment in the world, but only 1% of our foreign direct investment goes to China. So by some important measures, there's actually very little economic integration between the US and China. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, but certainly part of the reason is that China remains relatively closed to trade and investment, particularly in important sectors for the United States, like agriculture and modern services. The United States and China have a lot of dialogues. People have mentioned this. We have dozens of dialogues. The flagship one is called the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. I participated in 5 of those. We have other economic dialogues. The US has tried to use these to encourage China to open up, but frankly, I haven't seen much progress in the last few years. I don't think there's really been much movement forward in US-China economic integration. Now, China has its own complaints. I want to be clear about that. China, for example, would like the US to recognize China's market economy status. China would like the US to be more open to its direct investment into the US. So each side has issues, The point I'm making is I don't think there's been much progress in the bilateral negotiations during the past few years. One of the issues we've talked about, of course, are the big imbalances with China having a large surplus and the US having a large deficit. Those have come down in recent years, but largely for cyclical reasons, and I think we're poised to see those imbalances perhaps rise again. Ken Lieberthal made the point this morning that each of us has our own reform agenda. So looking ahead, the United States has a big agenda of increasing savings and enhancing competitiveness, but China has a complementary agenda of reform that would tend to raise household income and encourage more consumption. So my second point is, I don't think that there's been that much progress in the economic openness between the US and China in recent years. My third point is about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I see the United States getting frustrated with this lack of integration with China, and for the United States, the Trans-Pacific Partnership was an attractive way to move ahead with Asia-Pacific economic integration with a group of countries that were interested in moving ahead with a high level, or what we call a high quality trade agreement. China was initially quite hostile to this US initiative or US participation in the TPP. But over the past year and a half, I've seen China become more open to the idea of TPP, and China worrying that it'll be left out. At our last strategic and economic dialogue between the US and China, the important agreement between the two was to negotiate a bilateral investment treaty. That would require China to open up a lot of closed sectors, liberalize interest rates, its exchange rate, open up the capital account. This would really be a very major set of reforms. So I view that as a very important initiative, but it's also going to be an initiative that's difficult to successfully negotiate. One of the topics for this session is internationalization of the renminbi. I welcome internationalization of the renminbi. I think it depends very much on reforms in China, strengthening contract rights, deepening the financial system, more flexibility in interest rates and exchange rate. And so I think that's a great reform agenda for China. So I welcome the reforms that would lead to the successful internationalization of the renminbi. The fourth point I want to make to bring the last couple points together is it's easy to imagine a positive scenario of further integration in Northeast Asia. And for me, the positive scenario is we successfully negotiate the TPP pretty soon. South Korea joins relatively quickly. The US and China negotiate a very good bilateral investment treaty, and that's a stepping stone for China joining TPP. And then we've got a broad Asia-Pacific deep integration agreement. That's a really good foundation for growth, for integration, and I think it's a foundation for peace and stability. Unfortunately, my fifth point, I have to end on a somewhat more negative or balanced note. My fifth point is you've got domestic interests in all of our countries that are fighting against that positive scenario. So in the US, for example, our Congress has not yet given trade promotion authority to the president, so it's difficult to complete the TPP negotiations. In Japan, you've got special interests that are probably going to be somewhat difficult as we move to TPP completion. South Korea seems to be the really good citizen in all this, by the way, as a country that really appreciates openness. But certainly in China, there are going to be large state enterprises that resist this whole move because it's going to involve China opening up protected sectors in finance, telecom, media, for example. So I think you're going to find interest groups in each of our countries that tend to resist this. And so we may not get the good outcome. And I think if we don't negotiate deeper integration, then it's likely that this whole engine of trade and growth in Northeast Asia will stall. So the last thing I'll say is I think of trade liberalization or trade agreements very much like riding a bicycle. You either move forward or you fall off. And I think we all need to pedal very hard to work against the special interests and to get deepening integration in Northeast Asia. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. He covers 6 different issues that is related to the mainly the trade issues and openness of the market of China or something like that. But it is the dollar's position, point of view, and let's turn to the yuan's point of view. Yeah, please.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks for the invitation by Korean Foundation for the Advanced Education and Beida and Brookings. I'm not an economist. I think the only reason I was chosen by Chinese team, maybe it's because of the name. Ask the yuan to compete with dollar. But to be frank, it's a long way to go for the Chinese yuan to compete or challenge the American dollar, even if we have already signed maybe Chinese currency swap with 24 countries. But the total amount is only 400 billion US dollars. Even if we have a 3.5 trillion foreign currency reserve, but more than 2/5 are buying American national bonds. So still we are living in a dollar world, but this not necessarily means we don't have Chinese dream of the internationalization of Chinese yuan, just like my personal dream to compete Mr. Dollar in the future. When talking about the future of this region's economic integration, we have many new words like TPP, RCEP, BIT, FTAs, and also, for example, like cross-strait, we have ACFA. Between US and Taiwan, the TIFA. So many new concepts. Being a lot of economist, it's very hard for me to follow. So today I want to just focus on one single topic, that's a TPP, and what Chinese perceptions on TPP. When talking about the regional economic integration, it's very easy for us to think about Japanese first. In last 1980s, it was Japan that is the driving force for the regional economic integration, but it failed because of maybe several reasons. One is that Japan lack of deep structural reform, and also because of politically Japan is outside to the mainstream of this region, and also militarily it is too linked with its allies, the United States. So after that, in the late 90s and early 21st century, it tends to ASEAN, 10 ASEAN countries, ASEAN-centered, 10 plus 1, plus 3, plus 6, now plus 8, East Asia Summit. So when 10 plus 8, then finally means 10 is nothing. So the 10 small countries cannot afford to drive in the other 8 powers. So now, what is the future? At a very sensitive moment, America is back with TPP. So TPP is not an American initiative. It was established by 4 small countries years ago, and then joined by 3 not that small countries like Australia, Vietnamese, and Peru. But only after Obama decided to join, then TPP becoming a hot word. So then in March 2010, Obama and the other 7, the 8 countries held the first TPP conference. Then we see Malaysia, Canada, Mexico, and finally in 2013, Japanese decided to join. Now 12 countries. Then becoming a very popular phenomena in the economic order in this region. At the very beginning, Chinese has a very deep alert and worry. What that means, TPP, is another encirclement or containment strategy in economic term against China, or it's another conspiracy theory by the states to split the East Asian economic integration. So I try to follow American logic, why America wants TPP. For me, I think TPP links 2 other things. One is a TTIP, TTIP. transatlantic trade and investment partnership. Another link is linked to American rebalancing policy toward Asia. So those two links gave me an impression that there were three intentions behind the TPP of the states. Number one is want to strengthen its own economic growth and employment. So that's why TPP for the states to the Asia is to take rather than to give. Another reason I think maybe is to show American is an Asian Pacific power, deeply involvement in this region. And the most important reason, as Mr. Donald just mentioned, is want to set up the new rules for the post-WTO and the high standards of labor, environment, IPR, and SOEs, state-owned economy reform. So those three cannot say just against rise of China, but it's highly related to rise of China. This is the Chinese generally response. So at the very beginning, we were a little bit alert. But the second response is that we should wait and see, because it's a very strange compilation. Some countries is for economic consideration, like Canada, Mexico, because of their NAFTA. Some others just like a game, playing a game, just like Chile. Chile participated in almost all the multilateralism framework in the world. So it's interested in joining this kind of mechanism. Some other countries like Vietnamese maybe is for political consideration more than economic. And Japan, I guess, may be more strategic consideration than purely economic consideration. So it's a very strange combination. Then we'll see, maybe it's very hard to achieve a final consensus. So far, we think it's correct. Let alone that the TPP, if becoming a reality, should be past the test of American Congress. But the Trade Promotion Act is very hard to be passed given the midterm election season. So the second response is very easy, that wait and see. And the third response is that we should do something to prepare for the future. The first thing that we should do is to deepen our own reform. If you read our report of the third session of 18th parties plenary, you can find we have already conducted 60 great reforms. And I found that 10 of which related to the so-called high standards of TPP, which means Chinese is preparing for the future. And another thing that China is now doing is to speed up our negotiations with FTA with South Korea and BIT with the states and with the European Union. So we fully preparation for the future. And the fourth confidence, after doing that, fourth response is that we should be very confident, because China is we have a $520 billion US trade with the states, 400 billion with Japan, 400 billion with ASEAN countries. We're number 2 trading partner with all American allies in the region except for Philippines. So we're worried. A TPP without China means much less than with China. So it's hard to imagine that a TPP without China. So we should be confident. So generally speaking, China's response is a little bit inert and a little bit easy and fully preparation and should be self-confident. Now I think it's a very healthy response. So my final point is that how South Korea's choice. Korea now decided to join the negotiation, but on the other hand, want to have FTA with China. So just like a game, and I just read some newspaper said Korea wants to join TPP, but afraid that Chinese is unhappy for that. So FTA with China first, and TPP the second. So I don't think that way. China is very, very open. If you want to join TPP, that's okay. FTA, we can follow that. But we cannot, just ask you to make which. But just remember, in 2001, our bilateral trade is only 30 billion US dollars. How about today? Today is 230 billion US dollars. In 2015, we will surpass 300 billion US dollars. Parallel comparison is your trade with the States. In 2001, the same year, you have 40 billion US dollars. But now, only 100 billion US dollars. So the trend shows that China-ROC economic trade has more promising future than with the States. Think about that, and then make your follow your decision. Not join the TPP just for political and strategic consideration, but for the future of our regional economic order. Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. TPP is Pacific Ocean is a very big ocean in this sense. Yeah, every country is included. So probably very soon, for the free trade, we will just make a sort of a trans-global partnership or something like that. Anyway, yeah, Dr. Yuan mentioned that in Korean side we need to choose which position you will take. There's some kind of initiation issues between US dollars and Chinese yen. And we will take the Korean position, choi for choice. Sorry, it is just a joking. And in Korean pronunciation is Choi, but Choi being Professor Choi, we'll just take the Korean or probably mention some Japanese side as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate President Park In-guk and Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies for making new wave in Gangnam. Gangnam is known as not intellectual, forum, but perhaps this is beginning of new trend of new Gangnam style, because it is a rare occasion to draw up to the 900 or 800 audience who still keeping their seat after lunch break. It is amazing phenomenon. So I congratulate. Yeah. Well, I have choice, right? So that's great. That's great. This morning we heard interesting debate among political scientists talking a lot about importance of securities life and death problem. So from that aspect, what we're discussing this afternoon, trade investment, looks so insignificant. But it is mainly through trade investment how we can expand the scope and possibility for maintaining peace and security. So in that regard, even if the discussion we are having right now is quite boring, but it is important to prevent any possible conflict and so on. Well, before to understand what is going on in terms of competing architecture for the future of North Asia, we need to understand what kind of economic landscape has been evolving over past decades or so. Well, number one, we need to understand the evolutionary nature of production network or supply network, if you will, in this region. That is Korea, Japan making a lot of investment as a trade to China, and China becoming the manufacturing powerhouse for global consumer shop and exporting to US and advanced countries. But nonetheless, intra-regional trade among three countries remaining very sorry state of up to 20% or so, compared to the NAFTA, 40%, compared to European Union, 65%. That means a lot of room, a lot of potential to be fulfilled. And in that context, also I'd like to mention very important asymmetry between manufacturing service sector in this country, because of manufacturing is so important, driving these countries, but we sooner or later it's going to hit the limit. because number one, internal pressures, that's aging. Already Japan is becoming a hyper-aging society. So it's not news when you go to Tokyo, total population decreasing, even so-called reproductive aging population is decreasing. Korea is going to be soon join the hyper-aging society, year 2026. This is a country where 1 out of 5 in the street will be very aged older person. And China is following the suit. So that means within a 10 or 20 years time frame, these three countries, aging is the problem. Then there will be internal challenges to redesigning their economic composition, which is favoring manufacturing at the expense of service sectors because of job potentials. And also there has been, ever since 2008 financial crisis, mounting pressure from advanced countries to redesigning economic strategic game, focusing on service sectors. So whether you like it or not, you have internal pressures and also you have external pressure to change your nature of economic paradigm. So in that regard, I'm going to be surprised if any new trade architecture is not addressing the question of so-called service sectors or something going beyond both issues. Having said that, except TPP, we do not have that sort of ambitious trade agenda. RCEP, people saying that TPP is competing with RCEP. I'm telling them, come on, that's not even the competition. Because TPP is driven by US, even though US is having its own domestic problem, which is lacking trade promotion authority. But RCEP, even if in terms of potential, the 10+6 countries, populations, GDP, all that combined, but they do not have, number one, intellectual power, and they do not have any strong driver, because the usual suspicious country like China, Japan, they are not quite mindful in this game. Because for China, the number one priority, as far as I can see, is finishing China-Korea FTA. And for Japan already jumped in TPP, so this RCEP is having any strong ownership. So we have TPP, which is quite active, but a lot of hiccup before they're going to finish the final line. And Korea-China FTA, even though I advise Korean government repeatedly, you should play very ambitious agenda, but Korean government is not quite listening to me. And President Park Geun-hye, she actually openly promised to finish as soon as possible by the end of this year. That means we're going to have very much small scale or minimum scale, not that ambitious trade agenda. So that means TPP is likely to be the only game in the town, realistically speaking. But the question is TPP is going to be expanding universe? That means at the end of the day, is TPP is going to reach to the China? I'm suspicious. Even if a lot of my Chinese colleagues kept saying that, well, our mindset is changing and showing some sign of positive shift, but I think it will take a lot of time before China is going to accept the concept of rule changing and some institutional challenge, such as labor issues, environmental issues, even if Chinese make a lot of great strides in these important areas, but it will take much more political ambitions and leadership courage to take up this issue. That means what will happen within a few years down on the road, we're going to see delay, procrastinations, and so on. So that means in these regions, despite this region has been growing by leaps and bounds because of their outward orientation, but this momentum is not likely to be sustainable. So we're going to face constant challenge from domestic voices. Stop. We do not have any much benefit from this opening up. As Dalla mentioned, he pointed out in last 10 years, there's not a significant deal except Korea-US FTA. The reason why is somehow free trade is not becoming any more fashionable because a lot of public, the awareness whether it is true or not much benefit is coming from free trade. So that is important perception we need to maintain. So that means if that happens, all these countries, do they have attractive plan B? That's the main question. It looks to me South Korea has plan B because by having on the Pacific side, Korea-US FTA, on this continental side, Korea, the EU FTA. And also looks like China, they try to have Korea-China FTA. But in this game, my concern is Japan. For Japan, despite Abe's courage, at some point even outrageous courage, I don't think the Japanese are ready to finish TPP to the satisfaction of all these participants. So that means it looks like Japan doesn't have any attractive plan B. And so that is going to be main concern. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 presenters, and it is quite interesting because the positions are quite different. As you know, that in political economy, the new institutionalism has been very popular during the last 2 or 3 decades, and every country has their own political and economic properties and characteristics. So it is very difficult to just make a very universal and textbook-like free trade agreement. So Professor Che emphasized some kind of social political reasons and that kind of things. And now let's turn to the discussants, and they're going to give us some kind of 6 or 8 minutes comments on these issues that is raised by the presenters, or you may just add some of your own, just the positions as you wish. Let's start from Thomas Wright from Brookings Institution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to President Park and to the Korea Foundation on Advanced Studies for inviting me here and for having us here for this terrific conference in this beautiful venue. What I would like to do is to say something about how to think about regional economic integration, regional order, and then speak a bit about what we heard so far and some of the economic trends, I think, globally that are affecting regional integration and some of the choices that countries make. It strikes me that just looking at the events of the last month or so, that Northeast Asia is actually, and East Asia more generally, is actually relatively unique amongst regions globally for the way in which economic integration includes all of the states, almost all of the states in the region, with the exception, of course, of North Korea, including states that are geopolitical rivals with each other. So South Korea, Japan, the United States, China are all part of the same sort of regional economic order. And that is actually not the case in Europe or in the Middle East. You usually hear that Europe is much more advanced than East Asia on integration, but that usually is said only with respect to Western and Central Europe. Europe as a whole, particularly Europe including Russia, excludes certain countries from the economic integration. And so there is no regional framework in Europe that includes Russia in the economic architecture of the continent as a whole. Now that's for quite good reason. I mean, Russia has been traditionally outside of the Western European and Western and Central European order, but I think it has had a consequence that we've seen recently because that rivalry is basically unchecked by interdependence. So we have this very sort of severe competition now between Russia and its neighbors, and then Russia and the rest of Europe. And Putin has really defined a path forward that is quite economically isolationist or rejectionist of integration. In the Middle East, of course, outside of oil cartels, there's really no economic integration, to speak of. So what East Asia has, I think, is quite unique and important, which is economic interdependence and integration overlapping onto geopolitical competitors and all of the normal power politics, that we see. And that, I think, is a very important, regional asset that is here that is often overlooked because the temptation is to compare East Asia unfavorably with Western and Central Europe rather than sort of Europe as a whole. And so I think that that level of economic integration is beneficial for the most part in promoting a stable regional order. But it can also exacerbate tensions. It can also have a downside. And I think the downside is when you see the two different orders that was spoken about in both of the panels this morning, that the security order really organized around the United States goes in one direction, and the economic order really increasingly organized around in China is in a different direction. And that's why we hear states say they never want to have to choose between the two, and it's a matter of balancing those, you know, two dimensions of order, the security and the economic. And the problem is that if they keep diverging, there will be sort of tensions, and maybe at some point states will have to choose, or China will see an advantage if the order is, or the regional economic integration is increasingly organized around it, and it is a big sort of player, might see a benefit or incentive in using that leverage over others, and we've seen a bit of that recently. So there is, I think, a sort of a soft underbelly to the economic, you know, integration. And I think it's in that context that we see TPP, because in some ways when people say that TPP is about China or is not about China and is about regional order, it slightly sort of misses a point, I think, for me anyway, is partly about trying to ensure sufficient diversification in the region's, you know, economy. So the U.S. is engaged, you know, China is engaged. All of the countries are maybe playing a greater role, you know, than they were before. And if the regional integration, economic integration, is sufficiently, you know, diversified, and if there's different sort of sources of demand for products and investment, and all of those different types of economic activity, I think that is less likely to be sort of used as leverage by any one country, and it's more likely to provide a stable, you know, foundation for the diplomatic and political, you know, order. So I think that's why these initiatives are so important. It's about trying to bolster the economic order and trying to increase economic activity throughout the region as a whole, but certainly to ensure that the US can continue, you know, to play, you know, an active role. And ultimately this will be good not just for, you know, the United States and the immediate sort of signatures to PP if it's ratified, but also I think, you know, to China as well, because China has a strong interest in a healthy, sort of well-diversified regional and economic order in which it can play, you know, a big part. The second thing I want to talk about is sort of the economic trends, and this gets to a point that David made that I'd like to come back to at the end, that really things are quite delicately balanced between a positive outcome, you know, and a negative outcome. I think there are several reasons to be concerned that there are sort of negative trends out there that could detrimentally impact upon economic diplomacy. The first is that we've seen, there are three I think I would highlight. The first is we've really seen the end of the BRICS era. The idea that emerging powers, these major emerging powers, are growing rapidly by 7 to 10% a year, and that there's this transformative power transition, the rise of the West, and this amazing convergence between the West and everyone else, I think is a story really that is a story of the past decade and not of the contemporary moment or of the future. Most of the BRICS are in some degree of economic trouble. Russia, of course, is now completely cast out, although it was never really a normal part. China has major domestic economic challenges that I'm sure we'll talk about on the panel, particularly on the debt side. India has challenges of its own, and of course other countries, including the US and Japan, have problems too. But we, I think, are beyond the point where there's a group of countries that are rising inexorably and rapidly, and that produces sort of a very positive input into the regional and global economy. The second is that the G20, I think, will be much more difficult to manage in the future than it has been in the past. That's partly because of the role that Russia will play going forward, and we'll see how difficult that is at the Australia summit later this year. But I think it also has to do with a variety of other reasons that the G20 hasn't really gotten its act together after coming out of the immediate crisis. And the third point, which has come up, I think, for a number of the panelists, I think is really a common sort of theme throughout all of this, is that the governments of many of the countries involved in regional economic integration basically know what they sort of need to do, but they face very severe domestic constraints to prevent them from doing that. And we see that in the United States with the constraints on getting a trade promotion authority in the Congress to ratify TPP, and maybe broader opposition to TPP and TTIP, as well, that goes beyond just the fast track authority. And that, if that were to be defeated, it would really be against the collective sort of views of most of the people in both parties who work on these, issues. So it will be really to do with domestic issues. And I think the fact that the US is still in a sort of sluggish economic environment, and sluggish economic environments do reduce the room for maneuver that governments have. In Japan, of course, as well, with the, it's been said that Japan needs TPP to sort of implement those third arrow reforms that Abe needs, but in some ways precisely because he's taking on domestic interests, that could create difficulties for ratification of TPP. And then throughout the board, just generally on economic reform, there of course is strong domestic opposition in most major countries, not just in Asia and the Pacific, but also more generally globally. So we have, I think, a sort of a moment that's delicately balanced, because there are some plans out there to try to kickstart the regional, economy, but there are these strong sort of risks, and it is quite possible, I think, that we will fail rather than succeed. I mean, hopefully, we will succeed. But if you look, for instance, at TPP, the expectation was that that TPA will pass, earlier this year. There's still a very strong determination, to do that, but the time frame has been lengthened somewhat till after the midterms. And so whether or not the negotiations are successfully concluded, it does, I think, very much hang in the balance. So I think there's a real need for a renewed, sort of doubling of effort to try to tip that balance from the negative to the positive, so we can have some achievements which I think are very, very not desperately needed, but much needed because of the sort of sluggish growth throughout all of the major economies, and the need to get them moving. Thank you.
Thank you. When I hear your explanation, the TPP is highly complicated, and not only the economic issues, but also some kind of a geopolitical and political initiatives. So it seems to me something like elephant issue, just the elephantine issue. Just every country just touch the different parts and just explain their own way. So it is quite difficult to make the final conclusion. Okay, let's turn to just another Chinese discussant, Chinese WANG Zhengyi from Peking University.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to extend my thanks to the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies to hold us to discuss about the questions raised from Northeast Asia. We study the same standard economics, but in reality, we have a different policy prescription. Why? Just because that when we give the policy suggestions, we have to base our individual countries' unique needs or characteristics, like that. So here I would like to say that when we study or analyze China's foreign policy, especially foreign economic policy, we should pay attention to changes. One is domestic changes, another is regional or global changes. But here we focus on the regional changes. We should try to find the linkages. I mean that so if we study the economics, the technical theories, the principle is the same. But in reality, the policy is very different. So look at the regional changes, especially since 2009. 2009 is a turn point for this region, especially regional economic cooperation. Before that, especially from early 90 to 2008, look at this regional cooperation. We are very prompt that we East Asian countries find our unique approach to regional cooperation in comparison with the EU model or EU way. We found our special way or Asian way, like that. I mean, at that time, during that period, that we have at least three kinds of approaches to a regional economic integration or regional cooperation or regionalism or regionalization in this region. The first one is Japanese approach, Japan's approach, based on a flying goose paradigm. Japan is very active, especially in late 1980 or early 1990s. The second approach from the United States, and at that time, states changed its policy from the balance of power in Cold War to the concert of powers. We use a concept of concert of powers. So concert powers means that when we design the regional institution for cooperation, we invited a great power or great powers, major powers, to this region. For example, you invite India, Australia, we invited all Russia. We all invited a major power to participate in the discussion. This is the second we have. And third way from the ASEAN countries. We call this ASEAN way. It's a very unique. ASEAN way is very different from the EU way. ASEAN means a consensus, consultation and consensus. So at that time that we all East Asian countries said that, oh, we finally found our way. So it's suitable to it's available for our regional our region or especially our individual countries. So, but 2009, if you talk about China at that time, before the 2009, especially before 2008, for China is hesitated to put forward its own way. I remember that when I gave a lecture at the China's Foreign Affairs College or University, I asked the students, new journalists, what the Chinese way. They told me that the Chinese is a harmonious way. Harmonious way. And then I asked them, the ASEAN way is not a harmonious way. Why China had its own idea or its own concept to regional, especially East Asian regional cooperation? Just because for China, it's difficult for China itself to locate itself in this region because of the threat theory, China's threat theory. So, but from 2009, it's a turn point in this region, especially regional economic cooperation. U.S. do a little bit change. Other put forward the TPP, other rebalancing. So, what does it mean? That means that this one is institutional. It's different from the ASEAN one, ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, or ASEAN +6. But this one is a institutional one, just like the formal institutional, just like the EU way. So the big changes for this region to cooperate, especially economic cooperate each other. This regional cooperation changes. Look at the China domestic changes. When we talk about China, no matter what kind of problem, what kind of questions, if you ask China about what kind of questions about China, I mean, so one thing we should keep in mind, that is the domestic and open door. It's very different from the other countries in this region. This is why some Chinese scholars say that when we talk China, we don't have we have an overview. That means he given name, Professor Qing. He given name that is a process-driven approach. But that means that China is not the nature of the China. It's different from South Korea and Japan, even ASEAN countries. It's a transition. Remember this, a transition country. It's a socialist market economy. It's a market economy. Not a standard, not a laissez-faire market economy, not a social democratic market economy. It's a socialist market economy. So later we can discuss about that. But since 2000, especially since 2012, that China have a big changes dramatically. That means three changes dramatically. The first one, recentralization, while maintaining decentralization of authority. This is the first one. The second change is that China maintain or continue its domestic economic structure reform while open its financial market gradually. The third one, the China have to deal with the winner and the loser domestically, at social level, because it's related to China's social stability. So this is a big changes. I mean, since 2009. So if we combine domestic changes and the regional changes, then we can understand China's attitude to the TPP. TPP is American-centric regional architecture. So before that, although we have contending approaches to the regional cooperation, but this time. This time is an American-centric. It's a so-called standard regional cooperation architecture. So this is why states very conscious about the RCEP.
Yeah, Professor Wang, could you just wrap up in 1 minute?
Yeah. So. Last one, I have to finish that, conclude with one sentence. That is China's attitude, whether or not China join or participate, apply for the participate in the TPP, it mainly depends on the China's domestic reform. Thank you.
Thank you. So Professor Wang emphasized that some kind of a domestic issue, and the Dr. Dollar and some other persons also, Dr. Wright also mentioned that some kind of domestic issues, or it is well known by the Professor Putnam two-level games or something like that. So it can be discussed later more deeply. And finally, we have Professor Chang from Seoul National University, but it is quite contrasting because, as I mentioned at the outset, just Dr. Dollar and from United States and Professor Yuan from China, and another contrast is that Professor Chang recently returned from Beijing, from Korean embassy, as an economist. And Dr. Dollar recently returned to Brookings Institution from United States Embassy in Beijing. So two persons are some kind of a very recent experience in China to look at the Chinese economy and Chinese market, and then they have a very good contrasting views on China from Korean side and the American side. Okay, let's take your time. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start my comment, I fully agree with WANG Zhengyi, Professor Wang. China is traditionally very domestic-oriented. This is, I think, one point. The second point is Vice President Yum Jae-ho's Chinese pronunciation improved a lot. So I think that is because he stayed in Beijing maybe 6 months. Is that right? So it was really, I think, I heard your pronunciation improved such a big, I think, moving comment. Okay, so I have basically 3 points. As Professor Yum mentioned, I think, this session should focus more balanced. One is a monetary sector, and the other is, I think, the real sector of the trade issues. The first I like to mention is RMB internationalization, and I guess this is a very important issues. And as you see, China, after breakout of the Asian financial crisis, and also Asian financial crisis in 1997, and global financial crisis of 2008, and China did a lot of, I think, institutional contribution to stabilize regional, I think, a monetary stabilization. And one is China participated very strongly in a Chiang Mai initiative, and also now China is one of the largest donor country of the currency swap with many countries. So in that regard, I think China did really institutionally internationalize currency of Chinese itself. But unfortunately, how it is working and how it is, that circulating outside China, it has a lot of problems. I think, in that regard, I guess, the Chinese banking reform, mostly focusing on a capital account liberalization, is very important reform agenda after having announcing the CD government is, promoting more of the reform. And one, I think, very interesting observation is Shanghai Free Trade Zone, which will be, I think, one of the pilot areas to liberalize more of the currencies of Chinese yuan. You see, in recent days, there are many proposals from outside the world, even including London, and to assume some kind of a offshore RMB offshore market, which is very, I think, meaningful to next step of a RMB internationalization. But without having the capital account liberalization of China, I think it will be very hard to internationalize RMB, because in Korea, there are in a public general like to hold RMB, but once it is just giving no return at all, even they hold the money, then it will be almost useless in the end. So China should, I think, reform the capital account liberalization as quick as possible. In addition to that, I think, personally, China is facing two very fundamental problem. One is a overproduction capacity of China as a whole. manufacturing sectors. This is one. The second one is over accumulation of foreign exchange. Dr. YUAN Peng, it is reported that as of now, I think China recorded already almost approaching to $4 trillion as foreign exchange reserve. And then, how to handle that? I think without having a capital account liberalization, it is a very hard job to be facing the Chinese government. So this is my first comment. And the second is some reservation on the TPP and FTAs. I have personally, Darla mentioned about, even though in Northeast Asia there are a lot of, I think, the trade exchanges, but why we have no regional trade agreement? I think this is an intrinsic limitation of Northeast Asia, because the inter-regional trade ratio has gone up, but the basis for that is investment-driven. It is extension of a international, a global production network. So that doesn't mean that we consume that inside Northeast Asia. We produce inside Northeast Asia and then export that to somewhere else. You remember that China having the access to the WTO in 2001, they just hosted more than $1 trillion of FDI. That is key focus, key forces driving having achieved such a big trade amount in the world. I think that this is intrinsic limitation because of that. We don't have a big interest in having regional trade agreement, I think, in Northeast Asia. This is one. The second is TPP. Regarding the TPP, I think, a TPP has really complicated issues because, China, even though Mr. Yuan mentioned about China is no more resistant to the TPP, but if you go back to a government document or a party central, very important document, they just designate a couple of industries which will not be open to the outside, I think, businessmen, including the telecommunication and oil industry and others, which is really important because of the security purpose. And I think, a strategic, implications to China. Okay, so this is one, I think, regarding the real sectors. And is there any options to be taken intra-regionally? I think, nobody mentioned about return back to some kind of a regional, a cooperative project. For example, the Tumen River Development Project, a long time ago, I think, 20 years ago, the UNDP initiated this project to Northeast Asia, and I think that did some kind of contribution, the development to the more peaceful ways of handling the regional problems. As of now, I think, one very interesting changes is climate changes in Northeast Asia. I mean, very near to the Tumen River. 20 years ago, it was too cold, so maybe operation time cannot be more than 8 months a year. So many businessmen hesitate to invest around there. I think this is, so we know the climate change, a global warming give us more chances to extend the business hours. I guess, this is one. And the second is regional countries facing many problems, which may, if we have really a cooperative objective functions, then we may do some job. For example, Russia is, after having the Putin as president, Russia is more putting emphasis on Far East, one. The second is China. In China, a big China has many reasons, but northeast provinces, what they call Manchuria, has somewhat outdated compared to other areas. Previously, the Manchuria was mostly developed areas, but if there is some rooms to cooperate and to promote that kind of project, then Manchuria might be developed further. That is good for Chinese, I think, interest. And one more thing is, Japan is facing, a sluggish economy for more than 2 decades. But Japan has money and also other tools to do some job. If there is reasonable, a consensus is arrived, and then Korean Peninsula and South Korea and North Korea, we may, spot one areas to pilot, develop, and it might be the starting point similar to the special economic zone of Shenzhen. Okay, this is one. The other possible way is if we, in the morning session, there is no discussion about an economic approach to the peaceful, changes of the Korean Peninsula, and if it is possible, South Korea and North Korea, even in North Korea, if there is no sensitive to develop, for example, railway connection from south to the Manchuria or the Russian areas, and then it might be good for the region. And also to the north, I think, the railway construction is not affecting a lot to the residents of North Korea in the short time. I think, that might be, we may put as agenda regionally if it is possible. That's my comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Not only the TPP issue and Professor Chang raised the issue, other issues, for example, the touches a little bit about North Korea or Japan and the Tuman River development or something like that. So to take the advantage of moderator, if I just sum up and wrap up very simply, and the TPP issue is a highly complicated one, and every country has their own interpretation and their intention. It is strongly related with their national interests. So the whose initiative it is, somebody thinks that it is United States or Japan or China will join later or something like that. So it is highly complicated one. So how about because our topic of the third session is that the future of regional economic order in Northeast Asia, we cannot omit Japan and North Korea, especially in Korean government. We focus on the reunification. There will be a real good prospect for the future economic prosperity in this region. So if you have any comments, between us, and for example, related to the internationalization of RMB and also the TPP issue, very quickly just make a comments on it, and then let's move on to the North Korea or the Japan issues a little bit more. Then it will be more, some kind of a prosperous discussion. Okay,
So I agree with you. It emerged that the TPP is fairly complicated. But I don't think we should confuse that with the fact that it has enormous benefits. So there are serious research estimates of the gains from TPP. They're very large. There are estimates of what would be the gain if you included China. China would be the big winner in a TPP that includes China. And there's a logic to that because, when you analyze who gains from these trade agreements, whoever starts out with the largest distortions or the highest protection, that's the country that gains the most. So the United States is already very open. So the economic benefits to the US are rather minor. Economic benefits to China would be very large. Economic benefits to Vietnam are extremely large, for example. I don't remember the estimate for South Korea. But so a couple of points. The main one being that the economic benefits are very large. I have no problem with RCEP, but the estimated benefits from that are extremely small because, as I understand it, the countries who participate can opt out of opening up many sectors, and therefore it is in fact not trade liberalization. So it might be a nice political statement, but it's not trade liberalization. It's not really going to bring about a lot of benefits. So I look at TPP as an opportunity to really bring down trade barriers for the potentially largest number of Asia-Pacific countries. There would be very significant economic benefits, which would tend to go to the developing countries in the group. And then for me as an American, I see the main benefit as creating a more stable economic situation, and I think of that as being a very good foundation for security and peace in the Asia region.
Okay, any other comments on that? Yeah, Professor Chang.
I somewhat disagree with David Dalla because, it might be good for United States. I agree with you, regarding a benefit to the United States. But in the case of China, as I mentioned, more than half or over the half, the trade is already, I think, a tariff has, I think, almost a zero tariff rate. So TPP is more inclusive. One is, a government procurement agreement, okay, state-owned enterprises issues, and also a strategic industry issues. And then I think, theoretically, if it is agreed between China and United States, and then it will be good for both. But do you think China will open state-owned enterprises and strategic industries in such a short while?
Very quickly. Well, I think someone already made the point. I think it was Jia Qingguo made the point that China's reforms coming out of the third plenary involved many, many different measures. He pointed out that this is something that the United States largely supports. And if you read the third plenary documents or Premier Li's speech last month, the National People's Congress, it lists a lot of reforms, including, collecting more dividends from state enterprises, opening up more sectors to international competition, trying to create a level playing field between the state enterprises and the private sector. So if you take all those documents seriously, then joining TPP would be a way of committing to the reforms that China's own leaders and analysts have decided are good for China.
I have 1 minute comment. China is implementing the policies after having experiment or the pilot studies in somewhere else. I think document is giving a good message to the business as a whole. I think this is a long time range rather than right away they will implement a new reform to Chinese whole market. So is it in 5 years? Is it in 10 years? I think look at the Shanghai Free Trade Zone issues. Shanghai Free Trade Zone is I think one of the pilot testing ground for reforming China somewhat differently. The first agenda it was proposed was almost 15 years elapsed, but it starts and it was received by the central party, but the details has not yet announced. So that means even though the document is already shown that China will do a lot of things, but it's a document only, not real the situation of China.
Okay, yeah, Professor Wang. Yeah.
I would like to do a response to the Davis view about TPP. I mean 2 points. Well, first one is that academically, no problem. We have a report about your academic circles. We calculate its cost and the benefit. I mean, actually, it benefit China's economic growth. No problem. This is the first point. The second point is that, but in reality, I mean that is at least by now it's not available. Why? You just at the very beginning of your speech that you mentioned about WTO, but remember, I mean, from 1985, China applied for that GATT. Then 1993 or 1994 applied for the entries of WTO. Remember one thing, that after China's entry into the WTO, China's economic economy make great progress. All the countries, especially in this region, benefit from China's open door policy economically. But remember one thing: before WTO entries, just because China spent 50 years, 7 years, half the time, 7 years to have a whole debate domestically. Just because of that whole debate domestically, then it's China took the institutional reform, government enterprise reform, and then laying foundation for China's further economic growth. So following that logic, I mean that. No problem. TPP, China policymaker, we believe that. They understand very well. They received a very good academic training. I mean, this is why I emphasize all the standard economic textbook. No problem. But the problem is pace and secrecy. That pace and secrecy.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, there is a hot debate. In Japanese saying, in principle, everybody agrees, but in reality and in specific, everybody opposed. Okay, let me give you the Professor Che, and then Yuan later. Yeah.
Well, we need to be realistic about this TPP because most panelists they tend to focus on economic aspect, but which is not the nature of game. Because when you consider this TPP, it doesn't have any implication free trade agreement. This is about Trans-Pacific Strategic Partnership. That's what TPP stands for. So that means it is not only economic endeavor, but it goes beyond to the point of creating new alliance, new airline, new network in this 21st century. Having said that, I think President Obama and Democratic Party, they had so much at stake, tried to finish at least sometime early this year. So to give some victory to Obama. Everyone's talking of Obama's lame duck even, first years in second term. But, well, my judgment is around the time President Obama is in Asia, in Tokyo, and whether he is going to have certain deal with Abe in making the breakthrough in this TPP is going to be litmus test. If they're not going to be successful, then when you consider what is happening in Capitol Hill about granting this trade promotion authority, I don't see that many chance. So that means this TPP will wait at least couple of years. But even that couple of years time, China is going to ready to embrace all these ideas, opening up very important strategic sectors, as Professor Chung mentioned. I have suspicions. So that realistic scenario is, TPP is going to be concluded if U.S. is pushing very hard, and if Japan is going to be a bit cooperative, which means Abe is going to dismantling very organized resistance by Japanese bureaucrats. Then you have first batch of TPP with 12 countries plus possibly Korea, 13 countries. And then the window opportunity will be open for any aspiring country, including China, to be a new member of TPP. As we have seen the case of Chinese accession to WTO and Uruguay round, they took more than 10 years. Because US and also European Union, they try to take advantage of that possibility, try to squeeze anything from China so that China can transform from some commanding economy to something close to quasi, the market economy, but still that reluctance in giving status of market economy. So that's nature game. That's nature game. And having said that, do we, Korean government, do we have any alternative? Because in Korea we have a very important debate. That is, should we reach out to China and conclude Korea-China FTA first? Or at the same time, can we jump into TPP there are two lines of argument. One line argument is, well, we need to finish Korea-China FTA first. Number one, China is the most important large trade partner. And second, when you concede importance of Korea-China economic and strategic and diplomatic matters, it's going to be nonsense to squander opportunities. And third, well, that argument is, suppose we're going to join TPP, which must be American initiative, then Chinese government is going to be not happy. I've been hearing this kind of argument so much times. Whenever, my colleague from Washington, D.C. or Ottawa are making a visit to me, their question was always about this. Well, Professor, you constantly arguing that Korea should, playing the game at one side, playing the China card at the same time, TPP card, but is it not going to provoke China? I told them China is a great country. China is a great country. They know the strategic importance. Okay, so that concept of strategic importance we need to bear in mind.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's quite interesting comments on that. And Professor Yuan, you just add some more. And we have only 15 minutes left, so yeah, so fast the time flies. So I just got a very quick comments from you, and then we will. I'm not sure whether we will discuss the North Korean issue or Japan issue. We don't have enough time. Probably we have to leave it to another occasion. And I've received 3 audience questions, so I have to introduce to you whether it is just some of you just answer for this question. Okay, please. Yeah.
I think when we talk about TPP, we should put TPP and TTIP together. If TPP is for constraining the rise of China, and the TTIP and the TPP is for dealing with the rise of the rest. As he mentioned, that the BRICS or the other 20 emerging markets, because today the WTO cannot constrain all those emerging powers like India, like China. We are now the promoter of free trade, while the United States is more conservative in the free market. For example, we want to investment in the States, like Huawei, but Huawei waiting for 10 years, office in DC, they have nothing to do. We want to buy more to help the states to stimulate this employment. But what we want to buy is the high tech, because we do have the low tech products in China, but it's reluctant to sell. Then if you have this kind of narrow-minded thinking, the only way is to set up another TPP, TTIP, the new rule to constrain the emerging powers' new requirements. I think the American cannot absorb China, because this is against the rising of China. Without fully implement of the so-called high level of the standards, how can you imagine American truly welcome China to join the TPP? Then TPP means nothing, I think. This is my observation.
Okay, very briefly, I just read the questions from the floor to Thomas Wright, and you mentioned the debt of China, and will it be a problem for China some debt or something like that? Yeah, I'm not quite sure what's the real question it is, but anyway, the second question is, to what extent that the Chinese holding of U.S. Treasury bills, as you mentioned, $4 trillion US, that promotes stability in their bilateral economic or political relationship? Not all of the questions to you, so some of the United States participants can answer this question. It is another unique question. Are the protests of students in Taiwan affecting the way policymakers in Beijing approach trade deals? Yeah, very, very unique questions. So I'm not sure, who can just answer these questions. Or very, very briefly, you just make a comment on that. Okay? Yeah. That's right.
Okay.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, first, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I might take the first two. Just on the second question, I understood if China has holdings of U.S. debt, if that's stabilizing or it creates vulnerabilities. You know, over the last few years, there's been a lot of studies and focus on this, and most of them tend to suggest that it is not sort of inherently destabilizing or a threat to the U.S. because there's the sort of balance of mutually assured, you know, financial destruction if China were to dump its, you know, holdings, and so there's some sort of stability there. But I would just add 2 points to that sort of view. The first is that China, I think itself, is aware that this is not a particularly healthy state of affairs for it to have these holdings, and therefore has been trying to reduce them, you know, because it is it does create risks from China's point of view to, you know, to be so in hoc to the U.S., you know, to the U.S. Treasury on bonds. They probably need a more diversified set of holdings. So they have gone down, I think, recently. I think David suggested they may be about to go back up, or that there may be a cyclical, you know, thing there. But the last sort of numbers I saw, which were about a month ago, they were at multi-year lows, I think, because of just how they've gone down over the last few months. But the second point, though, is that I think there is one set of circumstances under which they are potentially destabilizing or create some sort of vulnerability, and that's in a crisis sort of environment. If there were some sort of geopolitical, you know, crisis, or there was a lot of uncertainty like there is in Europe at the moment, I think it would be difficult to be completely assured that, you know, that things will go as normal. So China may have an incentive, you know, to dump some of them, even though it would hurt their economy if they believed it would hurt the U.S. economy more, you know. Or you could envisage a situation where, you know, in a global sort of financial crisis, the U.S. needs countries to sort of hold the line and not to, you know, get rid of the U.S. treasuries quickly, and you know, China may take a different sort of view because it has so many, and there's sort of a first mover advantage in getting out first. So the bottom line is, I think there is some vulnerability, but it's not nearly as much as some people say. But I think over the long run, it's definitely in the interest of both the United States and China, you know, to reduce those gradually and in a responsible manner. On the first question, I was just really reflecting the view of some economists in the US and elsewhere, that the rate of accumulation of Chinese debt recently is a negative sort of warning sign in the Chinese economy, and that you know, if the 7.5% level of growth is achieved through leveraging debt, that is, you know, potentially an unhealthy sort of development, and you'd be better off having growth about 5.5 or 6% that wasn't as dependent on debt. But that's one of the sort of concerns that's been raised by some of the financial analysts in New York.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other comments on that? Yeah. How about?
Just one point on the Chinese buying American national bond. Actually, we have buying 1.3 maybe trillion US dollars, and American total national debt is 17 trillion US dollars. So Chinese buying only maybe 7% of the total American debts. So not as big as somebody imagined, but it's enough. It's maintaining the mutual assured financial stability of our two countries. So strategically speaking, it's quite meaningful. But still, it's a big problem because 1.3 trillion is not a small number. So now Chinese think about diversifying Chinese foreign currency reserve. For example, buying some Japanese yen, euro. But the problem is that euro and the Japanese yen is even worse than, even unstable than American dollar. Then buying some maybe gold or mineral, then produce some high price. Chinese threat theory is popular. So the only way, and this fundamental way, is that changing or transform Chinese economic growth way. That is what we are doing now. But it's maybe take a while, take a long time. So Chinese changing the current way of buying national bonds, I think is gradual. Gradually, we're sooner or later coming to balance in future.
I agree with Professor Yuan that there's not really any option for China. I mean, if you have $4 trillion, there's nothing you can do with it. There's no market deep enough to absorb that. So it would be irrational to move a large amount of that into any of the other instruments he mentioned. And I think the fundamental problem is China's just accumulated way too many reserves. You know, the IMF has a methodology for assessing, you know, what are reasonable amounts of reserves, and that China's accumulated too much. So there's not too much you can do, but at the very least, it'd be helpful if China would stop accumulating reserves. You know, last year accumulated another $500 billion. So I think, you know, finding ways to reduce the reserve accumulation would definitely help. And they're kind of opening up China more so it could import, allowing more flexibility of the exchange rate. These things would help. And on the U.S. side, we've been encouraging China to do more direct investment in the United States. And Professor Yuan mentioned there have been a couple of cases that have run into national security interests of the United States, but that's a very small number of cases. If you look at China's outward investment, the U.S. is the largest destination, and you've probably seen the recent deals like China buying our largest pork producer Smithfield, China buying U.S. energy companies, you know, so tremendous amount of Chinese investment coming into the United States, which we welcome, and then we just wish that we had reciprocal openness into the Chinese market because we think that would create a healthier two-way relationship. But the point on the reserves is China investing more in real assets in the U.S. is an alternative to reserve accumulation, and it's one that we've been encouraging for quite a long time.
Okay, thank you very much. And as you know, that it is very rare and the valuable opportunity that we have because the policymakers, not the direct policymakers, but the think tank specialists just gather here from United States, Brookings Institution, and also the Peking University School of International Studies. So it is a very rare occasion, but unfortunately I cannot cover all the issues. Just like yesterday, you just raised the 5 issues, but only 1 or 2 issues are discussed. So if we have a chance later, probably thanks to the President Park, will give us another just opportunity to discuss this issue, and then we will have more fruitful discussion. And finally, I just give one of the participants only 1 minute each of you, and what is the most important issue or the point that the American or Chinese or Korean policymakers should keep in mind for the, just like our topic, the future of regional economic order in Northeast Asia. And what is the major point that they should keep in mind? Probably some of you mentioned TPP or whatever, but anyway, it is your, I just gave you your free opinion. Okay, let's start from Professor Chang. One minute.
Okay, so I will use only 1 minute. My observation is, I think, still mutual understanding of counterpart countries by government officials and also think tank is still very limited. So I propose, very, I think, regular a public diplomacy, even including the government officials and also think tank, key expert between countries will be, I think, very promising ways.
For me, just 2 points. When we try to understand China's foreign policy, no matter what kind of policy, political or economic or trade or even financial, 2 points are very important. First one, when China makes the foreign policy, it had to balance domestic reform and international forces. especially, for example, international reforms, especially Sino-American relations, globally, regionally, and bilaterally. That's the first one. The second one that when China in the policy-making process of China's foreign policy, China dramatically had to rebalance its vested interest group. Without that, it's not it's impossible for us to understand China's foreign policy. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Wright.
Yeah, many of the issues we talked about today are becoming, if not zero-sum, they're becoming relative-sum in that they're inherently, competitive. And the way countries are defining their interests means that we will see sort of more winners and losers, or sort of the perception of winners and losers. I think the important thing to remember is that the economic issues are an exception, to that, and it's still very much a positive-sum game. If TPP happens, that on balance, I think, is good for China. If the Chinese economy gets beyond its current problems and recovers to robust growth, that's good for the United States and good for the region. So economics, even though some of the other issues may become more difficult, I think it's still an area where it's important that countries work together and root for each other to succeed.
Well, to me, the political leaders in these regions, perhaps their most important task is how to keep momentum of outward orientation. Even though I mentioned eventually they need to transform from manufacturing economy to service economy, but it will take some time. So that means without having effectively access to and link to global market out there, perhaps this region they're going to lose important, the engine of economic growth. But keeping the momentum of our orientation, that means, among other things, two things. That means the case of South Korea, it's been 10 years. Before that, we didn't have any FTA. Right now, we have several important FTA, so-called economic territory, about 60% is covered. But people are debating whether or not we are really gaining benefit from this opening up. The reason is, despite opening up, even deeper and wide opening up, but still we have not much competitions and inefficient distribution networks and collusion among monopolistic service providers and so on. So how you can effectively link the deep opening into the further reform and new trajectory of economic growth. At the same time, obviously we are going to have a lot of the tensions among domestic stakeholders. So how you can effectively communicate with them eventually, at the end of tunnel, it is always blue sky for all of us.
For China, undoubtedly, I think it's a domestic reform, because the third plenary has set up 60 different ambitious reform projects, which should be finished in 2020. Which means in 2020, we should establish the so-called aware-of society in an all-round way for 1.3 billion Chinese people. Only 6 to 7 years left. And the Chinese leaders set this timetable and set 60 different concrete reforms agenda, which should be tested by the Chinese people. So 6 to 7 years, I think, is a very, very limited time. So no country, compared to China, no country more want to maintain peace and stability in this region than China.
I think the important thing to keep in mind is that trade and investment agreements can be a really important way of locking in reform, and we all need to reform continuously. So, I'm a big advocate of moving ahead and trying to find deeper integration through trade and investment agreements. And I don't care whether you call it TPP or RCEP, or if it's a bilateral agreement between China and the United States. I welcome the largest possible number of countries participating in the deepest amount of integration. And I think that would really help all of our economies move forward, and it creates a very good foundation for the whole region. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And as I mentioned before, in principle, everybody agrees that openness is good for the each country's domestic economy as well. But the problem is the restructuring or domestic reform is another issue, especially for China. And probably they need some time to just adjust that kind of openness. So that is another issue. As you know, the Professor Che is also the think tank head of the Federation, Korea Federation of Industry in the private sectors, and also the Brookings institutions, top policymaking advisors and sort of scholars, and the professors from Peking University are also some kind of a strong influence on the Chinese economic policy-making processes. So this kind of discussion and mutual understanding is very, very, very important, necessary, and also especially it's not some kind of a bilateral or trilateral government negotiation, but it is just kind of a scholarly discussion, and I think that I really appreciate your candid and very vivid and very dynamic discussion for today's session. And I hope this kind of discussion, even though the Brookings members flew over a long time and then very much exhausted, but it is a very rare and very important and valuable occasion. So we will keep this kind of opportunity more and more. And lastly, I have to thank President Park In-gu and also the Korea Advanced Studies, Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies for preparing and organizing this forum and discussion. Thank you very much.